Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in a previous video, I explained how Samuel Beckett's 1965 film, Entitled Film, could be taken up as an explanation of the condition and meaning of the now nearly elderly generation called X. In this video, I'll be taking up one of the artists whose work has had a profound influence on Generation X in an effort to explain how it is that Henson's fanciful but radical experimental film style ended up aligned with the neoliberal aim of progressive educators and helped to create generations of conformists.
This is NET, National Educational Television.
In the same year that Beckett created his film, Jim Henson produced a 9-minute experimental film entitled Timepiece. Henson had formed his company, Muppets Incorporated, in 1958 after spending the 50s producing the television puppet show Sam and Friends for the NBC affiliate WRC-TV in Washington, D.C. Sam and Friends landed Henson and his puppets on national television with appearances on The Steve Allen Show, The Jack Paar Program, and The Ed Sullivan Show. But from 1963 to 1966, Henson turned his attention to non-puppet filmmaking. Timepiece is a film montage that illustrates and ruminates on the problem of time in a 20th century American modern industrial context. It works through an Eisensteinian dialectical montage technique, and the meaning of the work, as Eisenstein would put it, arises from the collision of independent shots wherein each sequential element is perceived not next to the other, but on top of the other. Henson's film fits very neatly into an Eisensteinian mode. Not only does it rely on juxtapositions of clips, but the theme of the film and the film's abstracted subject or protagonist both fit neatly into the genre of Soviet montage. Timepiece is not an exploration of a particular character with a peculiar psychological interior, but instead features an everyman character who is himself as fragmented as the filmic world he inhabits. As the images parade by over the film's 9 minutes, the viewers don't get to know or understand Henson, who selected himself to fill the frames. Instead, the viewer is held at a distance from the character and his world, enticed to view the goings-on as illustrations that keep pace with the drum beat, the jazzy music, and the sound effects. Watching today, the film seems almost cozy and comforting. The experience is very much akin to watching television. Henson's experiment will not challenge contemporary viewers, especially not older millennial or Gen X audiences, because we have already been trained to understand it and to enjoy the bouncy discontinuity. We already know what this film is. It's Sesame Street. Eisenstein's montage aimed at stirring up contradictions in the viewer's mind, not with the aim of shocking or titillating the audience, but in an effort to manifest what he described as the contradictions of being. The contradiction in being that Eisenstein referred to in his essay, A Dialectical Approach to Film Form, can be traced back through the revolutionary Bolshevik party that Eisenstein worked within, and from there to the German transcendental idealist philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel infamously broke with usual forms of logic and thinking. For him, X never equaled X, but always also equated to not X. This caused quite a lot of discord later on when the English empiricists and others caught wind of what this German egomaniac had been up to, but the idea that X equals both X and not X is the key to understanding what Eisenstein is speaking to when he claims that film should reveal the contradiction in being, and I think it explains the works of Jim Henson as well. In order to understand why Hegel thought that any given thing, for instance a puppet made out of green felt and with plastic bubble eyes, both is and is not, we first have to understand a philosophical problem that arose in various forms during the Enlightenment. We can start with the French weirdo René Descartes. One of the chief aims of Enlightenment philosophers was to discover a new foundation for belief and truth after the collapse of papal authority in Europe. Near the beginning of the 19th century, this quest for a new basis for reason and truth would be expressed by Immanuel Kant as an emergence from immaturity. We were, Kant believed, entering a new age wherein the people of Earth would be free to think for themselves rather than relying on the dogmas and strictures of authorities and experts. Earlier on, Descartes sought to do that thinking by clearing away all the old junk in his head, all the mere assertions, the old wives' tales, the cliches, all the unjustified beliefs. He decided to try to doubt every possible thing that could be doubted, to refuse to believe anything that he possibly could refuse to believe. Whatever he could not bring himself to doubt would be the first principle of reason, of thought, of power, of the new universal and reasonable authority. Descartes noticed that there were many things that were, upon inspection, easy to doubt. For example, it was possible to doubt that there was any world outside of his own mind, because no matter how real the world appeared to be, he could always be dreaming. It was possible to doubt that 2 + 2 was 4, because he could always be in error, or he could be tricked. The only thing that Descartes could not doubt was that he was, in fact, doubting. He knew that much, and he expressed it this way: I doubt, therefore I am. This left the world of philosophers in quite a jam, for while Descartes himself tried to return to God as some sort of all-powerful being that he could rely on to give the world some coherence, in the end, all he knew for sure was that something called thinking existed, even if that thinking was doubtful. If every thought one had turned out to be untrue, at least the thought itself existed. So it's this predicament that Hegel took up as he wrote his philosophy. In his Science of Logic, he wrote about it this way: we're in the position of attributing to someone a correct perception, with the writer that nevertheless he is incapable of perceiving what is true, but only what is false. Hegel, in his books The Phenomenology of Spirit and The Science of Logic, and others, attempted to demonstrate that the dilemma that Descartes and the rest of the Enlightenment had put us in had a solution within it. We seem to have lost touch with reality because it turned out that because we are small little creatures equipped with strange eyes and brains that are maybe programmed to think in this way or that way, and because we only look at or taste or feel the world outside of us, but aren't in fact able to know what it is like to be anything but what we are, then, well, we can't really know anything. To know anything, it turned out, would require us to know everything. The solution Hegel and before him Kant came up with was to reframe the problem. Accepting that our thinking proves our being also means that our being is a kind of thinking, even if it is decidedly the wrong kind of thinking. Rather than worry about proving what really exists out there, we need to understand what exists in here. Or as Kant put it, we need to understand what sorts of forms of thinking must exist if we are to have certain kinds of thoughts or perceptions. So, for instance, while it is certainly true that there may not be a world outside our own mind, we certainly do have a concept of such a world. Before we can even start to doubt that this world of objective reality exists, we first have to know what objective reality is. The same is true about other things Descartes may doubt. For instance, we may be wrong to say 2 + 2 is 4, but in order to be wrong, we first have to have the idea that such a thing as a number exists. And before we can mistakenly think that an elephant is large, we have to know what it is to have a size. Things like this: size, number, objective existence, were what Kant called the categories of our understanding. He called these things the categories of our understanding, even though he didn't believe we really understood anything, except our own selves. But for Hegel, this still left us a way to know the truth, because we could still understand the way our own thinking existed, and if our own thinking existed, then it was true, if only as a kind of thought. The objective part of our thinking involves two parts: the subjective personal part and the objective impersonal part. That is, we have perceptions and ideas that can be true or untrue, but we rely upon something objective, impersonal, and universal, even if we get all of our facts wrong. The ideas of Hegel and Kant and the whole process of thinking on our own without any recourse to an ultimate authority up in the sky who'll just tell us how the world is and what it is for is difficult. The truth of the world isn't something you can order from Amazon or quickly have in your possession just by reading the New York Times or the Daily Mail. Instead, arriving at the full truth of our own thinking requires some work and it takes some time. According to another Enlightenment philosopher, it also requires a struggle, a political struggle. What Marx figured out is that the way we understand the world isn't based solely on the ideas we arrive with, but rather because the truth is connected to us and our way of thinking, it is also something we develop and build as a way of life. The truth of our own thinking has to be developed as something that allows us to live more freely, as a way of behaving towards one another and cooperating together in order to expand our understanding and fully take up and work through the contradiction that is itself another category of our understanding. After all, the idea of being a subject in relationship with an object is itself another category of thought, as is the idea of society and the individual, or of worker and boss, or of nation and world, and so on. Eisenstein's montage technique aimed at discovering the truth of film, the contradiction that arose from the art form. People often describe Eisenstein's filmmaking as centering on conflict, and scenes like this from his 1925 film entitled Strike certainly seem to confirm the notion that for Eisenstein, conflict, and especially class conflict, was central to his work. However, from Eisenstein's perspective, all film worked through a collision of opposites. His description of how the simplest sequence in a film, say of this woman walking downstairs, is a process of sublation. In his dialectical approach to film form, he wrote, "Each sequential element is perceived not next to the other, but on top of the other, for the idea or sensation of movement arises from the process of superimposing on the retained impression of the object's first position a newly visible further position of the object." That is, for the meaning of a film sequence to emerge, each sequential shot must retain the meaning and memory of the image or images that came before. Eisenstein believed that film was conceptual, that it was an art form that was closer to poetry or prose in writing than it was to painting. He believed that films speak through images.
The following program is from NET, the Public Television Network.
For adults who were raised on Sesame Street, however, an objection arises. Namely, if the juxtaposed images we find on television create meaning through the same dialectical process that leads to self-understanding, the same process that Hegel described and Eisenstein embraced, why do we feel brain dead after binging old episodes of Seinfeld on Netflix? Put another way, if the experimental films of Jim Henson relied upon this same revolutionary conception of film, why are our young people less literate, more narrow or provincial, and less interested in the world beyond their immediate interests today than they were back in 1968, back before Sesame Street? In his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, the social critic Neil Postman described Sesame Street as a terrific educational tool, only he said that what it taught was how to watch television. In this way, it was as marvelous as other lessons in TV watching, such as The Tonight Show, That's Incredible, or Happy Days. Perhaps this is not as damning a condemnation as Postman believed, especially when one reconsiders Postman's other complaint against Sesame Street, namely that its claim to be an ally of the classroom was a pretense. In the middle of the 60s, Jim Henson created experimental films for adult audiences. And while the tone and perspective of those films is familiar to audiences raised on The Muppet Show and Sesame Street, the difference between Timepiece and a segment produced for the Children's Television Workshop is nonetheless noteworthy. One key difference is how Sesame Street creates a sense of safety and control for the viewer. In this classic clip from the 70s, children are presented with a contradictory lesson on safety. On the one hand, the man reading the newspaper is unnecessarily risking his life by ignoring the world around him. And on the other hand, the dangers in the world are all clearly marked, and even when he ignores them, the world works itself out for him so that he remains safe. And in this charming short, entitled Film is Magic, the viewer is invited to imagine that the world they live in might be the same as the world of film. The viewer is invited to imagine himself as a star in a film that he's directing.
Larry, you want to go and see a bird fly backwards?
This 3-minute short is, in its way, a prequel to the Matrix films, and just as with the Matrix, every viewer is invited to imagine himself or herself as Neo. In Timepiece, however, the world is fragmented and disordered, at least on the surface. The main character navigates through the landscapes and scenarios, and while his unconscious desires alter the world around him, these desires seem alien to him. They are, in fact, imposed upon him, and he is as trapped by them as he is by the passage of time. The difference between the 1977 segment Film is Magic and the 1965 short film Timepiece comes down to a difference in both audience and industry. Film is Magic was created as part of an experiment in progressive education and was funded by psychologists and academics who've been trained in and who emerge out of behavioral approaches to economics, sociology, and psychology. One assumption of this behaviorist approach to solving social problems, for instance the problem of inequality and differences in academic achievement, was that people are rationally bounded. They are emotional. Their ability to reason is limited. And the primary solution for the problem of a public that is cognitively lazy and likely to not think through decisions is to create architectures that nudge people to make better decisions. Educating a person who suffers from bounded rationality means creating conditions wherein they'll believe the right things, make appropriate decisions, and learn to be bounded properly. Henson's Timepiece is gentle and fun. It is lighthearted and even somewhat childlike in its obsessions and imagery, but it is ultimately a pessimistic and alienating film. There is no happy ending. The protagonist is overwhelmed by the filmic world he finds himself in, and he ultimately succumbs to the sickness of time or of the times. Film is Magic, on the other hand, is a power fantasy that urges the reader to accept the architecture of the built environment, of the mechanisms of society, as fitting nicely with one's own desires.
Stop! What if you were magic and could make things stop just by telling them to? Or make them go backwards? Go backwards! Stop! Then you could see what things look like when they're moving.
The world of Film is Magic supports and empowers the children who are the protagonists within it. However, there is one commonality between the two films that might lead us to go beyond the world as it is given, that might lead us back to the freedom that Hegel thought he discovered in the early 19th century. Both films communicate the idea that the world of objects is also the world of our own perception and activity. Both films lead us to consider our lives as something we are actively participating in creating, either through resistance or acceptance. In a previous video, I explored how every generation since World War II is actually an X. That is, every generation since the Second World War was Generation X because each generation since the invention of the atom bomb has found himself or herself in a world where meaning has gone missing. A world that they are responsible for creating and recreating, but also a world over which they have no control. We are all Generation X because even those of us with the power to make the world fast forward or rewind can't ultimately change the content of the picture.
Help!
If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out the previous video in this Gen X series. It's entitled, Why You're Generation X, Even If You're Not. You'll find a link to it in the top right-hand corner. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.